All right, everyone. It is time for the review, in which you watch me struggle through these test specs myself. Yay. So before we get started, how did you find this? Yeah, that's how most people find it. Ambiguous horse noise. What questions would you like me to address particularly as we go through this? Okay, chapter 2. Do you have a question or just you want to see it? Because we'll definitely see it. Okay. Anything else? Okay. If anything comes up, just let me know. Oh yeah.
Is this so? What we're doing today, like, is more of a general question. Of like writing out, I guess, like the promise structure. Is that kind of like what Bluebird is?
Yeah. So Bluebird does this somewhere deep inside of it.
So like, is there a way to like look at Bluebird and see anything similar to this?
Yeah.
Or is it so kind of like convoluted that you have to spend time reading to see its logic?
I mean, it's definitely more complicated, I'm sure, but I bet if we look right here, SRC promise, is promise a thing? Promisify, promise.js, that looks promising. Oh, promising, haha. Yeah, so it's definitely more convoluted. But look at this. Promise takes an executor, has a bit field, which I guess holds the state. It has some fulfillment handlers, some rejection handlers. Promise 0, receiver 0. I don't know exactly what those are, but maybe one of those is like downstream promise. You can call fire event. Has sort of a more general notion of events, I guess. Caught, reflect, then. So yeah, it's all in here. Okay, cool. So let's get started. I'm just gonna bomb through the test specs. I love writing to test specs because you can almost write this without knowing what promises are, and then at the end you still don't know what promises are, but it's very satisfying. You feel a lot more satisfied. Okay, so the promise class is a function, expected undefined to be a function. I'm gonna write this as an ES6 class, so we see that. Oh yay, all my uncommented specs are passing. What is it? Chapter 1. Okay, let's just unx everything. It's a lot of... Okay. Everything is breaking. We are sad. Okay. The promise class throws a descriptive type error if called with no function argument. Okay, right, so I should have a constructor that takes an executor. This special constructor method is the equivalent of the constructor function if I did like function promise. This body is this body, same bodies. So if this is not a function, then we'll throw a new type error. Executor must be a function. Great. Expected undefined to be pending. So it starts with a pending internal state. Is it just this dot state equals pending? No. Is it this dot underscore state equals pending? Yes. Great. I'm doing this without looking at the test specs, which is kind of dumb. I should just have them open. But I have a finite amount of screen real estate, and this is how I'm using it. Okay, we have an internal resolve method, underscore internal resolve. Sweet. It has an internal reject method. I'm sort of setting up machinery here, I guess. And I'm passing some specs already, like, that I haven't even gotten to, which is funny but not surprising, often the case. Okay, so resolving changes the promise state to fulfilled. I now need to look at what resolving means. Okay, so resolving means internal resolve gets called, and then thereafter promise.state is fulfilled. Well, hey. That seems pretty easy. I feel like I'll have to write more in this function at some later point, but whatever. I'm passing tests right now. Everything is happy. A promise instance resolving can send data to the promise for storage. Oh yeah, this looks like more work. So what does that mean? Can send data to the promise for storage. When I call internal resolve with data, then, oh, now I have a value. My promise value should be some data. So I guess this will be resolve with value, and then value equals value. Okay. Resolving does not affect an already fulfilled promise. So this is where if I am already resolved, I can't resolve again, which makes sense because a promise, once it sort of latches into the resolved state, only ever holds that value. Yeah.
Can you repeat why it's a benefit to put the executor in a constructor?
It is not so much a benefit as the way promises are specified. Like, if I want to create a promise, I have to do it by saying new promise. Or if I want to create a promise by saying new promise, I have to pass in an executor. And that's just how promises are specified. Why were they specified that way? I don't know. It kind of seems like a reasonable way to glue the callback-based world to the promise-based world, because inside this constructor, or inside this executor, you now have access to two functions, two callbacks that you can give to some callback function to resolve it. On line 8.
Why is constructor?
As opposed to doing this.
Yeah, I did actually.
So this is alternate syntax for doing this. So these two chunks of code do the same thing. This is just a syntax you will see a lot, especially in React land, so I'm introducing it here. I feel like we saw it once before somewhere in some workshop, but you're about to start seeing it a whole lot more. And it's a little bit more terse. You don't have to like directly manipulate the prototype. It's kind of implicit by the fact that it's inside of this class. Okay. I'm going to comment this and continue. Okay, so I think we were looking at, oh right, if we're already resolved, then internal resolve should do nothing. So if this dot state isn't pending, or then return. Promise instance rejecting changes the promise state to rejected. I think I see where this is going. Send a reason to the promise for storage. Does the reason get stored in underscore reason or underscore value? Okay, so takes a reason, and this dot value equals reason. And I bet I can't reject a promise that's not pending. Promise instance rejecting does not affect an already rejected promise. Yep, great. The executor function, okay. So now we're getting, so this is sort of the basic machinery of the promise state machine. We can resolve with a value, we can reject with a reason, and once we enter either of those two states, we are stuck there forever. That's nice, but right now we don't really have any way to cause the promise to do that, apart from calling internal resolve or internal reject. And also, we don't have any way of knowing when the promise does those things, because we haven't set up the handler machinery yet. And so the first thing we're going to do is, I suppose, write something. We're going to call this executor and teach it how to resolve or reject this promise so that we can create a promise and have it like enter some state based on the result of an asynchronous operation. So the executor function is going to get called. You didn't say with what. The executor function gets called with two different functions, funception, resolve and reject. Okay, let's look at that. So, resolve and reject. Okay, so it just cares that there are two functions. So I'm just going to give it two functions like it asked for. Okay, the executor function resolve argument resolves the promise. So I'm guessing that what this function does is it calls internal resolve. I'm just gonna like get ahead of the spec a little and say that this should probably take a value and call internal resolve with that value. And the reject argument rejects it. This should be reason. Oh, cool. Chapter 1 is done. Yay. Okay, questions about chapter 1. Mostly setting up plumbing here. And then doing this thing where we call the executor. So just with what we've done in chapter 1, what can we do? I think we're not exporting this, right? But if we did, let's see, type of module find module exports promise. Okay, so I can still run it here. This check means that I can still run it in the browser, but now I should be able to import this, or require this in Node. Damn it. Where? Oh. Require.src pledge.js. Okay, so I have a promise, and I have a promise class, and I can create a new instance of it. If I don't call it with an executor, it tells me to, and if I do, then I can resolve it and see that I have a promise whose state is fulfilled with 5. I can't .then off of it, of course, because we haven't written a .then method. But I think we're about to. I think that's about to happen. Okay, any other questions before we get started on chapter 2? How am I calling it? Right here. Just by calling it. Did anyone run into like a bind issue when trying to do this?
Yes, that's why I thought like we had to bind this to here.
Yeah, so I'm getting around that. How? Yeah, the arrow function immediately gets around that. Yeah, this is a case where arrows are different than long form functions. If I did this, it is identical in every way except that it doesn't work because the because the this keyword becomes unbound inside of a named function, or I've heard these called free methods, specifically because the this keyword becomes unbound inside of them. Whereas inside an arrow, this is bound to whatever it's bound to in the calling context. So within this function, where it's well defined to be the instance of this promise.
Why we didn't use in a function, but we just like actually wrote the two functions outside of when you call it and then
Oh, so you said like this dot internal resolve equals function.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can do that too. That is fine as well. That is morally equivalent, I would say. Okay.
Does that mean like there's a case we made sort of error outside using arrow functions?
Oh yeah, there's I actually read an article recently. Dr. Axel wrote. Is that his name? No, I don't know. Wait, speaking JS by who? Who wrote this? Axel Rauschmeier. Teaching arrow functions. Okay, I'll try and find this article, but yeah, the new fat and concise syntax. This guy's like one of the major like JavaScript movers and shakers or designers or something along those lines, and he sort of suggests teaching arrow functions as like the default classic functions that sort of work like in the simplest way you might expect. And even maybe teaching arrow functions with the implicit return first, because this is like it's sort of very mathy. It like really hits our intuitions about what a mathematical function is. And then you can be like, well, you can explode out the right-hand side into like a block, into an imperative block by putting curly brackets around it, and then you can do more statements and stuff in there. And then if you want a free method, like if you want this to mean something other than whatever this is in the surrounding context, then you have to specifically say function. And I actually think that's a probably better way of teaching functions than we do right now. But he wrote this article, 2 months ago, and we haven't updated anything yet. So yeah, I kind of default to using arrows also because they're shorter. And they look so cool. Okay. Chapter 2. A fulfillment callback. Okay, so I think this is where we're going to get into attaching .then and stuff. Oh yeah. Wait, a promises_then method adds groups of handlers to the promise. Okay, so promise.then is not a function. We can fix that. Okay, so when we're called with a success handler and an error handler, we now expect this handler groups thing to exist, and it should have a success callback and an error callback. Okay, so then gets called with a success callback and an error callback, and this dot handler groups takes it. And we should probably initialize handler groups. Okay. A promises then method attaches a falsy value in place of a non-function success or error callback. Okay, so I'm going to do this with a helper function, so I'll be like is func success callback, error callback is func error callback, and then I'm going to write is func, which takes something that might be a function, and if it is a function, then it returns it, otherwise it returns, otherwise it returns false. Does that work? Yes, this is a different spec failure. So I did that just to keep this kind of readable, and maybe I'll even change this to be on success and on error, just to distinguish them from the things we eventually push into handler groups. Okay, a promise that is already fulfilled calls a success handler added by then. Okay, so in this case, if we've already fulfilled the promise by the time we call then we will call any new success handlers on that with that value. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so if this dot state is fulfilled, then should really I'm going to pull these out into variables so I can use them. And then here I can say if we have a success callback and we've been fulfilled, then call it with this value already has. Oh, it's the other way. A promise that already has a success handler calls that handler when fulfilled. Oh, I see. Okay, so now in internal resolve, I have to do this check again. This is kind of suggesting, it's getting a little repetitive, so it's suggesting to me that maybe I'm going to want to pull this logic out into a function, but for now I'm going to just be repetitive. Oh, but success callback here has to be like if this dot handler groups 0 and this dot handler groups of 0 dot success callback, then call it. This is very suspicious to me, the thing I'm doing here, because handler groups is an array. Probably I want to do this, I want to operate on the whole array, but here I'm just operating on the first one, so I don't know. This might pass the spec, but I think I don't want that. Oh yeah, calls all its success handlers one at in order one at a time when fulfilled. Okay, so clearly this is wrong. Clearly I have to call all of my handlers basically whenever I can, whenever I have a value that I need to give them. So I'm going to write a function that does that. And I'm going to call it, what should I call it? Fire. And what this is going to do is it's going to go through my handler groups, well, first it's going to say, am I resolved? If I'm resolved, I'm going to go through my handler groups and call all of the success handlers. Otherwise, I'm not going to do anything at all. So if state is pending, this should be underscore, then return. Actually, I think we could, this might be a nice case for a switch. So switch this dot state, and if we're pending, return. If we're, what are the other options? Rejected and fulfilled. If we're fulfilled, do something, and I bet rejected is something we're going to have to handle. Right now, we're just going to return. If we're fulfilled, what should we do? We should just go through all the handler groups and call the success callback with our value. So I think we only ever want to do that once, right? We only ever want to call a dot then, something that's in a promises dot then once. So I'm going to do this destructively. How do I do that? I think I can say let success callback equals this dot handler groups dot shift. I think this is not going to work. Now that I'm looking at it, this does not look like JavaScript.
Did you say while it has a length?
Yeah. That looks more like JavaScript. And then we'll call it with the step value. And I could even be like, let's pluck out the value from this. And maybe even handler groups. And now we can just call fire everywhere we want. So fire. This stuff fire. Oops. This stuff fire. Oh, cool. It worked. Okay. We're not handling rejected. I have this really strong feeling like we're going to need to do the same thing down in rejected, but I guess that's for another chapter. Okay, questions on this? Yeah.
Is
Oh yeah, I defined it up here.
Oh,
Yeah, I wrote a little helper for us.
sorry, but in this, we were facing an issue that array was not getting empty. How do you just take care of that?
So I'm shifting things off of it. Is that?
So
What you were doing?
use for each loop,
Yeah.
and then into that loop, whenever I'm just assigning a value to success function, I have to call shift on the same, or can I use that with for each?
So you were, in general, no, you shouldn't use a for. You're using for of.
For each on that this group handler, and we are using array dot for each.
Oh.
Loop rather than while loop.
So you were doing like handler groups dot for each.
And then we are passing element into that or
Handler groups dot shift. You were shifting out here.
no, we were not shifting. I mean, we got stuck there because it was, I mean, it was getting called multiple times and we were not using the value of that array.
Yeah. So another thing you could do is, if you want to use for each, you can. You just have to zero it after it. You have to say handler groups dot for each. Let's see. And what do I need? I just need the success callback. Then, and then this dot handler groups equals the empty array.
I tried doing that also, but
So that, I think, that's working for me.
So you I'll check after.
Okay. Yeah. This is this while loop is kind of the canonical way of draining a queue, which is basically what handler groups is. I'll just skip this. Okay. Any other questions? Chapter 3. Okay. Another promise that is already rejected calls an error handler added by .then. Calls an error handler by passing in the promise's value. Calls here. I've got a theory. My theory is that if I copy and paste this code into rejected, it'll work. Almost. I guess I have to change this to be error callback. Yeah, these are not actually different blocks, are they? These are the same block. Okay. Another promise that is already rejected does not call any success handlers. Error callback is not a function. Oh, this needs to check to see that these things are functions. Or rather that they're not falsy, because we make them falsy when we put them in. We just need to check here. Okay, if it already has an error handler, calls that error handler when rejected. Oh, I think internal reject just needs to call this.fire. A promise's catch method attaches the passed-in function as an error handler. That should probably just call on error. This.then null on error. Oh, great. Chapter 3, solved by copying code from chapter 2. So I guess all we had to do, chapter 3 was just just handling rejections. So we mostly just have to copy the machinery from handling resolutions, which involves draining the queue, but calling the error callbacks instead of the success callbacks. Mm-hmm.
What is that?
Oh yeah, what's going on with that? So good question. This is a short-circuiting, or this is a use of the short-circuiting Boolean AND operator, which is a fancy way of saying that in JavaScript, if basically the AND operator will stop evaluating an expression at the moment it already knows the answer. So if I do like any falsy value, or if I do a truthy value and a falsy value, I'm going to get the first falsy value always. So if I do like 0 and hello, I'll get 0. If I do empty string and window, I get the empty string. And JavaScript stops evaluating this expression the moment that it encounters a false value, which means that it's kind of equivalent to saying if error callback, then error callback of value. It's just a slightly more terse way of expressing that. Specifically, you'll see it in cases like this, where we're about to call something or about to use it, and we want to guard against it being falsy. You'll also see the OR operator used for short-circuiting, usually in a case where I say, like, let x equals something or 5. And that's saying if something is falsy, then x will be 5, otherwise it'll be something. This isn't the best way of handling default arguments. That's where you often see it. It's like, I have like some function, and it takes an argument foo, and I say foo equals foo or default value. That works if there's no sensible, that works if like foo can't be 0 sensibly, but if it could be sensibly 0, then it'll get the default value if you pass in 0, because 0 is falsy. A better way of getting default arguments now is to just make them explicit default arguments, which you can do. Good question. Okay. We're close, I think. Oh. This is the part of the test spec that looks a bit like a legal argument. Oh, and it throws shade, which I love. Okay, so for a given PA then adds a new promise to its handler group, what does that even mean? Okay, it means that the handler group has a downstream promise now, which is an instance of promise. Okay, so I should create a downstream promise. Which is a new promise, and I'm going to give it an executor that does nothing. Then adds a new promise to its handler. Oh, and I need to do this now. Okay. Maybe I actually didn't need that to be a variable, stylistically. Okay, it returns that promise. Oh, yep, I do need that. So return the downstream promise. Okay, promise chaining and transformation. For a given promise that returns, so for some promise PA, that's us, that returns promise B, that's our downstream promise. If PA is fulfilled but has no success handler, then PB is fulfilled with PA's value. So if I'm fulfilled and success callback is empty, then downstream promise should get resolved. So I think what I want to have happen is success callback should either be on success or it should be downstream promise dot internal resolve. So let's just do that, and I'll do that by extending isFunc to say maybe func and take otherwise, and we'll say if it's a function, return maybe func, otherwise return this otherwise function. And so now I can say if on success is a function, return it, otherwise do value downstream promise dot internal resolve with that value. this looks an awful lot like this. So maybe I'll just make these part of the, I'll have the constructor put these on the promise. So solve equals this. I try to bring things into local variables when I can, but that seems a little bit excessive. Did that make anything work? It broke something. No. Then method attaches a falsely value in place of non-function successor error callbacks. Oh. Yeah, that would break that spec, wouldn't it? I think we can fix that by deleting the spec. All right. So ordinarily I wouldn't suggest doing that, but in this case, this spec is not testing. It's not testing the correct behavior of promises. It's sort of guiding you towards a particular implementation that is no longer serving our needs. Because now we want the success callback to like be a function even if a function was not passed in. So yeah, that's fine. Here, we'll exit out and we'll bring it back if something else seems to break, but I think we just don't need that spec. If it's rejected, oh, so same thing. Oh, and now actually I should be able to say downstream promise dot resolve downstream promise dot reject. Okay, for a given promise that returns promise B. Oh, right. Okay, so if our success handler returns something, then PB needs to get fulfilled with that return value. Okay. So now what do we do? So now, if isfunc is starting to get like names less and less well named, I think, because it's about to do one more thing for us, which is that if this is a function, I actually want to call otherwise with the return value of that function. Otherwise, I just want to call otherwise with this value. So we're kind of doing this like optional composition. We're saying, so I'm going to call this something different. I'm going to call this chain. And it's going to chain I just want to say like chain A to B or something. But maybe it could actually chain an arbitrary number of functions. Maybe that's needlessly complicated. So if the first thing is a function, then we're going to return a function that calls A. I guess it only ever gets one argument. So It's going to call A and call B on the return value of that. Otherwise, it'll just call B of X. Oh, otherwise it'll just be B, in fact. No, I broke everything. What did I do? A promises then method adds groups of handlers to the promise. Expected function to be function. What? Wait. Adds groups of handlers. Expected. Oh, damn it. So now I'm returning a function that is not literally this. Okay, well, screw this one too. Yeah, what I actually want this to check is that it eventually calls S1 or S2, which I think would be a reasonable spec, but we're just not gonna. Here, how about to be a function, right? How be a function type of. Okay, I'll just comment those out for now. I think it would be better to just change them to check that it is a function rather than that it is a specific function. Okay. And now we're back to chapter 4, which is fabulous. For a given promise that resolves with then, if the error handler returns value x, PB is fulfilled with x. We expected it to fulfill, but instead it rejected. Well, that's bad. Why would that happen? Resolve, reject, resolve, reject. Okay. Chapter 4, if error handler returns. Oh, right, sorry. The error handler also needs to resolve rather than reject. Right, so this is kind of counterintuitive, clearly. I was like, this should, because this is in the error chain, it should resolve. But no, if your error handler returns, it has handled the error, and your promise, the chain goes back into the state, into the good state. Your promise is back in the good place, and it is now resolving again. Okay, if PA is rejected but has no error handler, then PB is rejected with PA's reason. Oh, maybe my chain was a little bit too clever, because now, if we have nothing here, we actually want to call reject. Which is really unfortunate. Maybe I should just explode this logic out a little bit more. And we're almost at time too. Such a shame. Okay, well, we can just special case this for the moment. So if this does not exist, then we just want to resolve. Or then we just want to reject, otherwise we want to resolve it. Okay. For a given promise that returns PB, if PA's success handler throws with a reason, okay, now we have to wrap all of this in try-catch. Which actually, we also have to wrap our executor in try-catch, which probably means we should write a function that like tries and catches some function and resolves or rejects our promise with that with the result of that. Okay. E is rejected with E. Okay, if our success handler throws a reason. So what we actually want to do is have chain take a promise, I think. So handler and a downstream promise. And if we got a handler, then we will call downstream dot, let's see. Let's move this into its own function. So try exec with an executor. We're going to try the executor, and if it catches, or if it throws something, then we will reject with that reason. Otherwise, the executor should resolve us. So now we can call this dot try exec with the executor. And so now here in chain, I should be able to say downstream try this executor resolve handler of value, which if this throws, then the downstream promise will reject. Otherwise, we want to just resolve it, I think. Downstream.tryExec is not a function. Oh, this takes the whole promise now. Great. Oh, okay, and that got us through, because now we're getting to what happens if we return a promise, right? We expected a promise to fulfill with testing, but instead it fulfilled with a promise to status testing. We are at 6 p.m., so I'm going to stop there. There's solution code that's posted. I also have a solution in my repo that slightly refactors this to be, I think the code's a little bit longer, but a little bit more readable. The standard disclaimer applies. So if you found this workshop overwhelming, it's designed to give you insight into how promises work, of course, and hopefully it gave you a bit of that. If all you're taking from it is like a bit overwhelming, that's okay. But one major takeaway is that they're implemented in JavaScript that you can write or that you will be able to write at some point, rather than being some sort of deep magic within the machine. They also, async await also actually has no particular hook into, I mean, those are keywords obviously, but we can use, after having written pledge, and in fact, after having written not even all of pledge, we can use these objects as things in async await. So like, all you have to do to all you have to do to use something in await is have it be thenable. So if I await if I have this function, I can say print and then give it something with a then method. And it will get called with it. And that's actually the only thing you need to be considered promise-like in JavaScript. Okay. Any last questions before we adjourn? I can feel the confusion. Tomorrow will be better. Tomorrow I think we're working on CSS, which has got to be the whiplashiest part of this curriculum. CSS is also confusing. Just but in a very different way. It's like visually confusing rather than mathematically confusing. It's also mathematically confusing, but subtle ways. Yeah. All right, have a good night. Let's see.
I mean, roll with it. Own it. Sorry. You gotta go deal with that. You always feel very janky, and it's always kind of like the why oh boy. Yeah. Also now I'm imagining a Greek. Why not? They're useless at this point. Oh, I know that I'm
So can we push up the solution, but then when I open it, there's nothing in it?
Oh, okay. I will push this.
both are sort of. Don't write it down. Oh, I see. Yeah. The second part of the sentence is what makes it stranger. Like, yeah. Just be like, hey, how are things? Yeah, so what were you doing?
Oh. I needed 2 lines of code, and then we were done.
Yeah.
I mean, like, my boss, it's
I'll
this
do it
thing
just
where, like,
remember.
he's had my phone for like 2 years.
Oh, in your work
Then he'll still email me
Oh.
about things just to be like, hey, let me catch up with you. And I was like, well, you don't just accept me that I'm in and I'm texting you. So, Jay, could you pick one? Because
today I think it's one of my
Yeah, if I could get everyone to never email me again,
I just want to
that's something that like the next does not get, and like never has a manager like
she's also
and you are respectful with it, like you want answers out faster, like so much faster. Yeah. I had to sit down very soon, like that I work with because they did have my personal email, so I just set up a like list all things from @hunter.qd.edu to my spam, and then every now and then they'd be like, "Did you get my email?" What email? And then my boss was throwing into the restaurant once. He's like, "Laura sent an email," and I was like, "Laura did not send an email. Laura did not send an email to my work email." I agree. No. You don't email me at home on the Sunday.
Probably. Yeah.
not like you want spouse to see your spouse was okay.
Static method resolved.
because I was originally supposed to be in it, 4 months. So I guess it was too cold. I didn't know that, well, I did know kind of, but when they put me in a room, I just figured that was going to be my room and then expecting an email, but no. And then they told me yesterday, she told me yesterday that I would have to go downstairs. And
Someone moved out.
I guess. It's like I've seen a bunch of people moving in though, too. So I saw somebody tearing their stuff down there last night.
I feel like you're paying how much for that? You're sharing a bedroom. 3 other people are paying different.
I know, that's what this other girl was telling me. She wanted to rent her room out to me, but I said I don't know. Like I found some other places that are like cheaper, but I'm just waiting on people to respond to me. It's like I haven't responded to an actual post, but I just need to wait on somebody to respond.
Maybe look at Street Easy.
What's that?
It's just like an apartment search type thing. You can look at rentals. But it'll be like a whole apartment.
I was like, at least like they could let me wait until the weekend. Like, don't do this in the middle of the but nobody responded, so yeah, and I was hoping like if they say I can wait until the end of the week, hopefully I'll be found somewhere by then and I'll just leave. She was like, she's willing to give me the rest of the month for free.
How much?
1,000.
Be worth it considering you get privacy. You found a place that you can go out. The Hotel Fund from the 29th of January through April 8th. The total is $2,500.
Where is that?
Yeah, 17. It's Airbnb. Check it out. January 29th through April 8th. So you're trying to be out ASAP.
Because I don't know what this apartment looks like this girl sent me. She said it's, well, no, I do know what it looks like. Let me show you this one that she sent me. I mean, she's talking about. Who is that one?
I was just gonna stay at home here.
February and March, it'll be 1,000.
Oh, yeah, so that's that number I sent you. Words and the.
Let me show it to you. Matter of fact, let me send it to you. It's she matter of fact, it's she sent me that.